Okay guys, we are going to look at the American Revolution. This revolution is going to really kickstart all the other independence movements, so we are going to look at this in detail. Not as much detail as you would have looked at it in 8th grade or next year in 11th grade. So one of the biggest influences on the American Revolution resided with these new Enlightenment thinkers. They came up with ideas about property and individual rights. So I'm going to go back through these guys. Locke said that people are endowed with certain unalienable rights. We know life, liberty, and property. People, the power of the government is derived from the people, popular sovereignty. We also see Adam Smith in this idea that the market is what drives the economy. It's what the suppliers and demanders are dealing with, and this is going to lead to exchange in the international market. We see Montesquieu starts to look at the science of government, and he's going to start calculating ideas about what are the trends. Voltaire is going to come around with the ideas that, again, the people do rule, and when there is a government that is oppressive, the people have the right to overthrow that government and form a new one. So beyond just the Enlightenment thinkers, we see that there is a dislike for their ruler, George III. He has decided to be an autocratic governor, king. And he wants to know that he is the final rule. He's the final say. And with the colonists endorsing Enlightenment thinkers, this does not bode well with them. We see from the wars that have gone on that the English, they have fought the French. They've fought in America against the French. And they fought in Europe against the French. And they have encountered a significant amount of debt, and so they now look to the colonies to at least shoulder some of that debt because a war was fought on their behalf for their protection against the French and the Indians in the frontier. We see that the lower classes are not represented in the government. They feel that they are not fully represented in Parliament. Religious tolerance, we see that most of the Americas, they had different religions, and one of the biggest things that all these religions taught is that all are equal. And when you have a government that is being oppressive and not giving equality, this doesn't follow their ideas, and they want to challenge it. Also, there's extreme pride in one's nation. Yes, they're Englishmen, but they have more pride in being Americans. And it's all of these things dovetailing together along with Enlightenment ideas that is going to lead to the American Revolution. So from colonization in the Americas has stemmed from 1607 from the first colony in Jamestown, the first successful colony. And we see by this time, 1750, all the 13 colonies are along the Atlantic seaboard. They have major cities. They've negotiated trade because of salutary neglect. They've been left alone. But salutary neglect is going to end after the 7 Years' War, which will also be called the French and Indian War. And we're going to see that the British Treasury is drained not only from the French and Indian War, but from the 7 Years' War that is going on in Europe. And the colonists have not been following mercantilism. They haven't been following the triangular trade and trading exclusively with England. Because they haven't been following that, England has been drained of revenue. England has been drained of potential revenue and taxes. So George III and Parliament are going to look to the colonies that they should pay for their own, for their protection from the French and Indian War. And this is going to lead to some legislation. But before I get to that legislation, there should be a paper that you got that we're going to look at, because this is one of the things that really gets the colonists upset, is the rights of an Englishman. The rights of an Englishman were included in most of the colonial charters that were created. When these colonies came over, they had documents that governed them, that identified them through common English law. The struggle against Governor Edmund Andros arbitrary rule of the Dominion of New England. They were trying to force that the colonies trade just with England, as well as the publications of John Locke's 2 treatises on government, which popularized the knowledge of rights. We talked about these rights, that people have the right to govern themselves, have a government that they like, and when this stuff is abridged, that the people have the right to overthrow a government. After the Glorious Revolution, the colonized identified the English Bill of Rights and other new legislation as the foundation for English liberty, safeguards against their tyranny at home and abroad, and under the laws that govern both king and parliament. After 1763, which is a key date because that's a French and Indian War, the colonists claimed the right of English subjects to be taxed internally only if they had representation in parliament. So they're saying, we don't have a person out there, they shouldn't be taxing us. Later, the Patriot movement will assert the English liberties to defend life, liberty, and property. But I want us to look at these English Bill of Rights because every single one of these is violated. And we have this common notion that the American Revolution was all about taxation, but there's other things. First thing is that the people had the right to be represented in the government. They had no representatives in parliament. The people, through their elected representatives, have the right to tax them. Again, no representative in parliament. Parliament shouldn't be able to tax them. Every person accused of wrongdoing has the right to a fair trial and to be judged by a jury of his equal. We will see that will be violated. Anybody arrested has the right to habeas corpus. I don't know if you know what habeas corpus is, but habeas corpus meaning body, habeas meaning held. You have the right to know why you're being held. So when people are arrested, usually y'all know those Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you said can be used against you in the court of law. Well, that's going to be something that comes from habeas corpus. But eventually, when you're booked in the jail, they'll tell you why you're being held. So any arrested person has the right to be knowledge of being held, informed of the charges against them, given a speedy trial, and released on bail while awaiting a decision in his case. A person may not be arrested, and a person's home may not be entered and searched without a written court order or warrant. This kind of sounds familiar because you probably know these as our Bill of Rights. Soldiers may not be lodged in private homes without the permission of their owner, and people have the right to ask their government to correct the abuses. A lot of these ideas come from the idea that people get to represent themselves. People have a right to be governed by themselves. People have a right to ask their government to correct stuff. And it's all of these things in the rights of an Englishman that lead to the American Revolution beyond taxation. So, first act is the tax on molasses. Again, there's no one in Parliament representing them, so they feel that they should not have to pay the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act also requires that they pay gold and silver for their sugar, which is not much. They don't have much gold and silver, so the colonists reject this and they boycott. The Stamp Act is actually an act that is going to tax legal documents. And again, it's passed by Parliament, which they have no representative there. And this is supposed to pay for troops to be housed in the colonies. And the colonists get upset about this because they're not supposed to house troops in their own homes. So the government comes out with the Quartering Act, saying that they must provide them. Again, this is a violation of the rights of an Englishman. The Townshend Act comes out, and it's another tax on lead, paint, paper, and tea. And the colonists get really upset because, again, there's no one in Parliament representing them. And here comes the Tea Act. Again, another tax without Parliament representation. And so the colonists feel that, again, they don't have representation. There is constant abuses by the government not to recognize them and give them representation in Parliament. So the colonial response to all of this is that they boycott goods. They physically attack tax revenue agents, and they're going to protest from boycotting to tarring and feathering revenue agents to petitions where they'll write the king and they'll write Parliament saying, please don't do this, overturn it. And we will see things will come to a fighting blow. The Boston Massacre actually occurs because in Boston, we know that this is the head of the revolution, but people are housing their soldiers. That's against their rights of an Englishman. And the soldiers will, one of the soldiers, which eventually will read a story in APUS, feels like he's attacked, but it was actually a guy who made a snowball, put a rock in it, threw it at a soldier. Soldier thinks that he's being attacked by a gunshot, and then he shoots, causing the other soldiers to shoot, and then this leads to the first bloodshed in the American Revolution. But again, they're reluctant revolutionaries. They are not revolting at this moment. Then we see with the Boston Tea Party. We know Boston, but there's other places that are doing this. New York, Philadelphia, Annapolis. In Annapolis, they actually burn the boat to the ground. And they're not punished, but Boston's punished because this is where the most of the revolution is occurring. This is where most of the trade is. So the First Continental Congress is formed. They convene in Philadelphia. And at this time, they're not really like, peace out, we're done. What they're trying to do is they're trying to establish a membership of all the 13 colonies to create a petition to George III saying, look, hey, let's agree to stuff. Let's reconcile. And after Lexington on the Concord, that's when they realize they need to establish a Continental Army, and they appoint George Washington commander of that army. And the revolution will erupt at Lexington and Concord. So here's Lexington and Concord. So the Second Continental Congress, they form. And what they do is they're actually still trying to do reconciliation, but they realize that that's not going to work. And so they declare independence. And this Declaration of Independence, like we know, it's going to list all the wrongs and usurpations of Parliament and the King in violation of the rights of an Englishman. But also it's another overture to other nations that the Americans need help in this revolution, and eventually the French will come in. And this will have a base in helping in the French Revolution later, because they'll get a lot of ideas from the American. So the Declaration of Independence, it declares them unanimously. But again, they're evoking ideas of Locke. They have unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then when a government becomes so destructive, the people have the rights to dissolve that government and form a new one, like Voltaire. And we're going to see they come in with popular sovereignty. They list their grievances. This is a giant breakup letter, and it says he. They blame everything on the king that he has done wrong. And again, they're doing this letter to get, when people break up, there's always two sides to the story. They're doing this side to the story to appeal to foreign nations to come in and help them in this revolution because they lack manufactured goods. The Battle of Saratoga is going to be so pivotal because up until this time, many European countries thought that the colonies would not win. They're going up against the most powerful navy. And when Burgoyne is the only one who shows up at this battle, they're able to defeat the British, and this will lead to the French joining in the war because, again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They want to see British suffer. And so this alliance, again, it's to burn the British, but they want to get back at them. And so they supply the American colonies with supply, well-trained soldiers, a navy. We're going to see that Washington, we've probably seen the Washington crossing the Delaware. He will flee Saratoga, come into Valley Forge, and the end of the war happens in the Battle of Yorktown. The French Navy prevents any of the British troops coming in and giving help to Cornwallis, and Cornwallis will surrender. Okay, so this is that whole thing that I was talking about. Okay, so amidst them declaring their independence, they will set up their own government. And the first real government is the Articles of Confederation. Again, they experienced a government where the British were violating their rights. So they did not want a strong centralized government. They established a weak central government and gave much of the power to the states, and it will be ineffective because the states were allowed to tax, so the federal government couldn't pay off its debts. The states were given control of the military, so the federal government couldn't call up arms. The federal government could not tax, so they could not pay off their debts. The federal government could not regulate trade amongst the nations. And so this led to disarray, which will eventually lead to the Constitutional Convention. Amidst the Articles, the only achievement of the Articles of Confederation is that it achieved independence for the nation. It got the negotiating of the Treaty of Paris, and it negotiated that we got all of the area all the way up to the Mississippi. But because the Articles of Confederation could not regulate commerce, the Constitutional Convention is brought together. And they're going to try to amend the Articles of Confederation, but because the Articles of Confederation requires a unanimous agreement on amendments, they cannot fix this. And so instead of fixing the articles, they just try to scrap it and create a new representative body. And what will happen is this new constitution is going to bring up 3 branches. We're going to see it, the only branch that was existed in the articles was the legislative, giving the people the power. But now they're going to create an executive, and they didn't have that under the articles because they felt that it represented too much of a king. But they're going to create it here. They're going to create a judicial branch because they had lacked courts. And we're going to see that this whole document's purpose is to create a branches of government that don't overpower each other like they saw in their time as colonies. And eventually they will add on to this a Bill of Rights. Okay, so we're done, and I'm going to go on to the French Revolution in another PowerPoint.